The torrential rain pounded the streets of Seattle that night, turning the city into a maze of glistening reflections. Ethan Miller, a 35-year-old taxi driver, navigated his old yellow sedan through the drenched roads, trying to ignore the growling in his stomach and the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. Life had never been easy for him, but in recent weeks, things had become almost unbearable. Overdue bills piled up, and the fear of losing his apartment tightened like a knot in his chest. While waiting at a traffic light, something caught his eye. Under a torn awning on the sidewalk, a woman huddled, clutching a small boy tightly. The sight was impossible to ignore. The woman seemed on the verge of breaking down, while the boy, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, watched the rain with wide, frightened eyes. Ethan pulled his taxi to the curb and rolled down the window, cautiously. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she could trust him. But the desperation in her eyes spoke louder. Holding the boy's hand, she hurried toward the car. When she climbed in, soaking wet, Ethan noticed tears mixed with the rain on her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to get home." Ethan nodded and started the engine. The boy, whom she called Jack, snuggled into her lap, clutching the blue blanket. The ride was quiet at first, but Ethan could feel the weight of whatever she was going through. "Trying to lighten the mood," he commented. "It's not often you see someone out in weather like this." "Where were you?" The woman hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Just trying to find a safe place." Ethan didn't press further. Something in her tone said it wouldn't be easy for her to talk about what had happened. But he noticed the way the boy looked at him, with a mix of curiosity and admiration, as if Ethan were a hero just for driving that taxi. When they arrived at the modest brick house she directed him to, Sophie fidgeted uncomfortably in the seat. She began, her voice faltering. "I don't have any money to pay you right now, but I can make it up to you later, I promise." Ethan studied her face. It was clear that every word cost her more than money. He knew his financial situation didn't allow for charity, but something in her expression stopped him from asking for payment. "Don't worry about it," he said with a gentle smile. "Just take care of yourself and Jack." Sophie looked at him in disbelief, speechless for a moment. Then, with tears welling in her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you, truly." Ethan nodded, watching as she stepped out of the car with Jack, shielding him from the rain with a blanket. He sat there for a moment, staring at the house until the door closed behind them. As he glanced at the back seat, he noticed something. The blue blanket had been left behind. Picking it up, he felt the soft, worn fabric in his hands. Maybe it's a reason to see them again, he thought. But at that moment, all Ethan knew was that he had done something good. And even though his own life was full of struggles, that small act seemed to brighten the night. It was well past midnight when Ethan Miller parked his taxi in the cramped lot outside his building. He climbed the creaky stairs to his small apartment, exhausted from the long day. The space he called home was modest, with peeling walls and furniture as worn out as he felt. After changing into dry clothes, he tossed the blue blanket onto a chair and collapsed onto his bed, drained but restless. The image of Sophie and Jack lingered in his mind. He couldn't stop wondering what could have driven the woman and her son to such a desperate situation. Was she running from something or someone? Life had taught Ethan that everyone carried their own burdens, but Sophie's expression hinted at a kind of pain he couldn't ignore. Just as he was beginning to drift off, his phone vibrated loudly on the nightstand, shattering the silence. The sound startled him, and he opened his eyes, confused. It wasn't like him to get calls this late, and for a moment he thought about ignoring it. But something urged him to pick it up. "Hello," he answered, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Mr. Miller?" The voice on the other end was calm but carried a sense of urgency that made Ethan sit up in bed. "Yes, this is Ethan." "Who's calling?" "My name is Richard Hayes. I'm calling on behalf of Sophie Carter, the woman you helped tonight." Ethan's heart raced. His first thought was of Sophie and Jack. Had something happened to them? "Is she okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, she's safe," Richard reassured him after a brief pause. "I'm calling to thank you for what you did. Sophie told me how you helped her in her time of need, even though she couldn't pay you. That's not something you see often these days." Ethan exhaled, relieved, but his curiosity only grew. "There's no need to thank me," he replied, trying to downplay his actions. "I just did what anyone else would have done. Perhaps it seems like nothing to you, but to her, it was far more than just a ride, Richard said, his voice thoughtful. She didn't share much with you earlier, but what you did had a greater impact than you might realize. I'd like to invite you to meet with us tomorrow, if you're available. A meeting? Ethan frowned, confused. Why? Sophie, and I believe you deserve to hear more about her story, Richard explained, his tone remaining enigmatic. It's important. If you're willing, I can send you the address. Ethan hesitated. This wasn't the kind of call he was used to receiving, and certainly not the kind of invitation he got often. But his curiosity and the chance to return Sophie's blanket won out. All right, what time? Richard provided a time and an address in Bellevue, a wealthy suburb known for its sprawling estates. The contrast between Sophie's modest home and this location didn't escape Ethan. Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'll see you tomorrow, Richard said before hanging up, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Setting the phone down, Ethan glanced at the blue blanket draped over the chair. Something about the call felt surreal, as if he'd been pulled into a story far bigger than himself. As he lay back down, one question echoed in his mind. Who was Sophie Carter, really? And why had his small act of kindness caused such a stir? The next morning, the Seattle sky was still gray, though the rain had subsided, leaving the air crisp and damp. Ethan drove his old taxi toward Bellevue, the address Richard had given him written on a crumpled piece of paper. As he crossed the bridge into the upscale suburb, the scenery began to change. Narrow streets and weathered buildings gave way to wide avenues lined with manicured trees and sprawling mansions that seemed to belong to another world. When he arrived at the address, he found himself in front of a gated estate. The tall wrought iron gates loomed before him, an imposing barrier to the opulence beyond. Nervously, he pressed the intercom button and announced himself. This is Ethan Miller. A moment later, the gate swung open with a soft click, revealing a long driveway flanked by towering oak trees. Ethan slowly drove his taxi up to the house, parking beside a gleaming sports car. He took a deep breath before stepping out, trying to shake off his nerves. The mansion before him was massive, its light stone walls and grand windows reflecting the pale sky. Ethan hesitated at the front door before ringing the bell. The chime echoed faintly inside, and moments later, a man opened the door. He was elegant and gray-haired, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. Mr. Miller, the man asked, smiling warmly. I'm Richard Hayes. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Please come in. Ethan wiped his feet on the mat and stepped inside, his unease growing as he took in his surroundings. The entryway was enormous, with polished marble floors and walls adorned with expensive artwork. Everything gleamed with a level of luxury Ethan had only seen in magazines. Richard led him down a hallway into a spacious living room where Sophie was waiting. This time, Sophie looked completely different from the woman he had picked up the previous night. Dressed simply but elegantly, she seemed composed, though there was still a faint trace of vulnerability in her eyes. Jack was sitting on the floor nearby, playing with wooden blocks, looking far more relaxed. Ethan, Sophie began, standing as he entered. I don't even know how to begin thanking you for last night. Ethan waved his hand dismissively, trying to minimize the moment. It was nothing, he said, glancing at Jack, who gave him a shy smile. I just wanted to help. Sophie took a deep breath, as though gathering the courage to speak. No, it was more than that. Last night, I was at my lowest. I thought there was no one left in the world who would help without expecting something in return. But you proved me wrong. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to her gratitude. Before he could say anything, Richard spoke up. Sophie isn't just a single mother struggling to get by, Mr. Miller, he said, his voice measured. She's the daughter of a very influential family here in Seattle, but she's been estranged from us for several years. For reasons that are deeply personal, she chose to step away from the life she was born into and build something for herself. Ethan turned to Sophie, his confusion evident. She nodded, her expression slightly pained. When I left my family, I wanted to make it on my own, without their influence, Sophie explained. But things didn't go the way I planned. I lost almost everything, and last night, I hit rock bottom. If you hadn't stopped, her voice faltered, and she clasped her hands tightly. Richard stepped in again, his tone softening. Sophie shared what you did for her, Mr. Miller. And when her family learned about it, they were deeply moved. They felt your kindness should not go unnoticed. Ethan blinked, stunned. Unnoticed? What does that mean? Richard smiled enigmatically. We'll explain everything soon, he said. But first, the family would like to speak with you. If you're willing to stay a bit longer, I believe it will be a conversation worth your time." Still unsure of what to expect, Ethan nodded. Something about Sophie's sincerity and Richard's calm authority made him feel compelled to stay. As he waited in the opulent living room, taking in the grandeur of the mansion, one question echoed in his mind: how had a simple act of kindness led him here? Richard led Ethan into another room, even more impressive than the last. Large windows offered a breathtaking view of impeccably maintained gardens, their symmetry a testament to the wealth and care of the family. Inside, a middle-aged couple awaited him. The man exuded authority in his perfectly tailored suit, while the woman's warm smile softened the atmosphere. Sophie followed closely, holding Jack's hand. "Mr. Miller, I'm Peter Carter," the man said, extending a firm handshake. "And this is my wife, Elizabeth. We're Sophie's parents. Before anything else, I want to thank you deeply for what you did for my daughter and grandson." Ethan shook Peter's hand, feeling the weight of his presence, and then turned to Elizabeth, whose gratitude shone in her eyes as she gently clasped his hand. "I only did what anyone decent would have done," Ethan replied, his voice modest. "I don't think it's something that deserves all this attention." "Don't underestimate what you did," Elizabeth interjected, her voice soft yet resolute. "Last night, Sophie was at a point where she needed kindness more than anything else. You gave her that, without asking for anything in return." Ethan remained silent, unsure how to respond. The truth was, refusing payment that night had been a sacrifice, but it felt like the right thing to do. Peter adjusted his glasses and continued. "Our family has always held strong values, Mr. Miller. Among them is the belief that kindness, when shown, should be repaid in kind. That's why we want to do something for you." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Do something for me? What do you mean?" Sophie stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "I told him how you helped us without hesitation, even when you didn't have to. For someone in your situation, that's rare," she said, glancing at her parents. "We believe you deserve more than just words of thanks." Peter took a breath before speaking again. "Mr. Miller, we want to offer you an opportunity to change your life. We understand that you've been facing financial challenges, so the first thing we'd like to do is pay off all your debts. But that's not all." He paused, a small smile breaking across his face. "We'd also like to offer you a job at one of our companies, specifically in the area of mechanical design and maintenance." Ethan's eyes widened, his disbelief evident. "A job? I'm not sure I'm qualified for that. I've been a taxi driver for years. I don't have any recent experience in anything like that." "Don't worry about that," Richard said from his place near the corner of the room. "We provide extensive training programs. What matters is your willingness to learn, and Sophie mentioned that you have skills that might just need a little polishing." Ethan turned to Sophie, puzzled. "Skills? You mentioned last night that you used to enjoy working on cars and doing small repairs before you became a taxi driver," Sophie said. "It made me think you might have a talent that you just haven't had the chance to explore." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. It was true. Before life had taken its toll, he had dreamed of working as a mechanic or even an engineer. But responsibilities and financial setbacks had buried those dreams long ago. Now, this family, strangers until yesterday, was offering him a chance to revive them. I don't know what to say," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Just say that you're willing to accept help. You reminded us that there are still good people in this world. Let us show you that kindness can come full circle." Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, his thoughts spinning. Finally, he looked at Sophie, then at Peter and Elizabeth, and gave a slow, hesitant nod. "If you believe I can do this, then I accept." Smiles lit up the room. Jack ran over to Ethan, holding the blue blanket that had been left behind in the taxi. "You can keep this," the boy said, his innocent grin lighting up the room. "It's magic. Just like you." Ethan laughed softly, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. He took the blanket from Jack's hands, feeling its worn but soft fabric. He had never believed in magic before, but something about that moment made him wonder. Weeks had passed since that surreal night in Bellevue, and Ethan Miller was now living a reality he had never imagined possible. He was working as an apprentice at one of the Carter family's modern workshops in the heart of Seattle. The job was challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose. The machines and engines that once seemed like a distant passion were now his everyday life. At first, Ethan struggled to adapt. The advanced technology and modern systems were a stark contrast to the simple repairs he used to do on his taxi. But with training and constant support from the team, he found his footing. More importantly, he felt a newfound satisfaction in doing something he truly loved. Sophie and Jack remained a part of his life. Sophie frequently visited the workshop with Jack, who seemed fascinated by the environment. The boy spent hours beside Ethan, watching every part he worked on, and sometimes even offering small help, like holding tools. One afternoon, while Ethan was adjusting a complicated part, familiar laughter reached his ears. He turned to see Sophie and Jack entering the shop. Jack ran up to him, holding a small drawing. "Look what I made for you," the boy said, handing over the paper. In the drawing, Ethan was depicted as a superhero mechanic, holding a shiny wrench with a wide grin on his face. Ethan chuckled as he held the paper. "Looks like I've got a new career as a hero, huh, Jack?" he joked. Sophie watched the scene with a warm smile. After Jack returned to exploring the workshop, she approached Ethan. "You look happy," she said. "I think I am," he replied honestly. "It's been a long time since I felt this way." Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did for me and Jack that night. But it makes me so happy to see that the kindness you showed us has brought something good to you too." Ethan smiled, shrugging lightly. "I just did what felt right. But you and your family have changed my life. I never imagined something like this could happen." Sophie was about to respond, but before she could, Jack came running back, holding another tool for Ethan. She laughed and shook her head. "I think he's already decided what he wants to be when he grows up," she said. That evening, as Ethan drove home, he reflected on everything that had happened since that rainy night. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. But what stood out the most wasn't the money or the job. It was the fact that his small act of kindness had become a catalyst for so many changes. In the end, he decided he wanted to do the same for others. With the Carter family's support, Ethan proposed a program at the workshop to train young people from underserved communities, giving them the opportunity to learn and build a career in mechanics. He knew what it felt like to believe the world had no chances for you, and now he could give back.
What did you think of the story? Let us know in the comments. It's amazing how one act of kindness can change an entire life. We'd love to know which country or state you're watching from. Please subscribe to the channel to catch our next stories.